This session is catching malware en masse, DNS and IP style. And our speakers are Dia Majoub, Thibault Ray, and Andre Tonk. There you go.
Thanks, Chris.
Check. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and share with you our research, which is about catching malware en masse, DNS and IP style. My name is Dia Majoub. I'm Senior Security Researcher at OpenDNS. And that's Thibault Ray, our great expert in data visualization, and then Andre Tunk, our Manager of the Network Operations. Without further ado, let's look at the agenda of today. So what we have is an overview of the OpenDNS's worldwide network, and then we'll dive directly into the bulk of the talk, which is about catching malware from a DNS perspective, but also from an IP infrastructure perspective. And then we'll have different visualizations to support our cases. And we'll conclude with some observations. So this is our OpenDNS's worldwide presence. We have 22 data centers across 4 continents. And it allows us to see a lot of traffic, mainly DNS of 2 types, recursive and authoritative. So now let's get into the main part about DNS. Before that, let's lay some foundations. So this slide here shares with you the current crimeware ecosystem, mainly for mass malware or commodity malware. It's mainly composed of 4 components. At the top you have the first stage of infection. You usually visit like a compromised site or a site delivering some malicious ads. And then you are redirected to an exploit kit domain. That domain will scan your machine with some scripts, and if it finds any vulnerabilities in your browser or plugins, it's going to drop a malware piece. And then the malware piece will try to phone back to some CNC domains. In this case, these CNC domains, they live on a proxy network that we dubbed the ZBot proxy network. That's kind of the main bulk of the study today. This one is actually a fast-flux botnet, and the domains hosted on it have a typical TTL of 150 seconds. Let's look at the investigation process here. So as we said, we focus on the ZBot fast-flux proxy network. We monitor it using 2 methods. One is Hadoop-based, and the other one is using our streaming DNS traffic. And with that, we can identify the malware that is phoning back to these CNCs. And then after that, we did some digging, and we found a pony panel, like another piece of malware hosted on one of these domains. And finally, we'll share some stats about the botnet, the clients, and the malware using it. So what is fast-flux? Most of you, I'm sure, know about it. It's a domain that maps to a lot of IPs scattered geographically, or it's a single domain, or it's a domain resolving to a single IP with a very low TTL. Now, how about a fast-flux proxy network? The slide here kind of shows what it's about. You have on one side the back-end CNCs, and then on the other side the targets, or the machines you are infecting, or you want to infect. And then in the middle sits a cloud of infected bots, serving as a proxy network, where the communication between the targets back to the CNCs has to go through. So in this case, if the infection chain succeeds, then the infected machine, the malware on it, will try to phone back to these CNCs, either to announce its status or to ask for extra configs or binaries or any other information. On the other hand, the CNCs, if they want to push extra payload, they will go through the proxy by pushing the binaries on the bots, and then from there they can get to the targets. In this case, the proxy network we're interested in is the one hosted on this pool of ZBot IPs, and the domains have a TTL of 150 seconds, like we said. There was another proxy network we studied like in the past, which was the Kilios. It was also fast-flux with a TTL of 0 seconds. Now let's take a quick look at the Zeus crimeware scene. So Zeus, as you know, is a very advanced crimeware toolkit. It allows you to build like a variety of malware streams given like inputs. And the input is typically a configuration file that has a variety of information, typically the config file, the config URLs for extra configuration files, the binary URLs for extra payload, and also the drop zone URLs if you want to exfiltrate data or announce something. And then you have web injects. These web injects are important because Zeus is mainly a banking Trojan, and it tries to intercept the traffic between like the browser of a client and the bank, let's say the banking website, and it introduces like extra scripts or HTML to ask you for extra information like the PIN number. And then you have a builder that takes that input and generates the binary. On the other end, you have the bad actor. He controls his botnet, and he can visualize the status, the health, the evolution, all kinds of information through a web-based control panel. Zeus has been extensively studied over the years by malware analysts and security experts, and this is kind of a timeline of the variants we know of between 2006 and 2013, thanks to a friend. I hope he's in the audience. The other thing we have to know is that Zeus, the malware, it needs to phone back to CNCs, like we said. And these CNC domains are mainly hosted on three types of infrastructures. So either compromised sites, bulletproof hosting, or fastflex botnets. We're talking today about the fastflex botnet piece. The other thing is that these domains, they will serve three types of URLs: config file URLs, binary file URLs, or drop zone URLs. Okay, so now let's talk about the methods we use to catch these. So one is using Hadoop, and the other one is using streaming authoritative DNS, provided you have certain filtering heuristics and a pool of IPs you're looking for. So the Hadoop-based method basically takes like a timeline or a set of data that covers a certain time period. And then what you do, you extract the domains that are fast-flexy with a TTL of 150 seconds. And then after that, you take the domain and IPs and you build a bipartite graph. And then from that, you extract the largest connected component. And then with that, you have the domains and IPs living in that connected component. You add the IPs to the pool of IPs that will serve you later. The streaming-based method uses the authoritative DNS stream. This is the one that we have. And it's faster, way faster than batch processing using Hadoop. But for that, you'll have to have your own heuristics. And you also have to have a seed of IPs. So for that, you start with a seed of ZBot CNC domains. You keep harvesting their IPs. And then as the stream goes by in real time, you grab any entry that has an IP that is in the pool of ZBot IPs or whose name server is also in there. Because usually the name servers and the domains are hosted on this kind of proxy network. So these methods are relatively easy to implement, but then we can go further by visualizing this with a nice 3D engine that we proposed yesterday.
Thank you, Dia. Check. So as Dia explained, there are two different techniques, to extract graph data. So we can extract ZBot CNC domains with their IPs. And now I would like to propose a way to visualize it. So let's take a look at the workflow first. We're going to take the source data, which are the logs, and we're going to convert it with our own Python library. Then we're going to visualize it. And finally, we can manipulate it a little bit. So it's very simple. The semantic net library. First, we import the library. It's in Python. We create a graph. We can add a couple nodes, couple edges, and then we can save the data set. Super simple. So that gives you the equivalent of the diagram you have on the right. So if we do that with the extracted data with the detection methods that DS proposed, we obtain something like this. So as you can see here, you see the Zeus CNC domains in red and the IPs in blue. And so you can see all the different clusters and what's been used over time with a period of 3 months. Now, finally, I can play the animation on the timeline, and you can see the evolution. So on the bottom left, you have the date, see the evolution. So you have three things that you can actually notice here. We have a growing pool of IPs and domains, and the IPs keep getting recycled all the time. And then you can see that the domains are hopping from IP to IP constantly. So yes, this is very nice animation, and the way we did that is when we extracted the log, we monitored, the domains and their IPs, and also the first time we actually saw them, with the timestamps, and we created, timeline of events that we can actually play in the data visualization engine.
All right, thank you, Thibaut. So the next step is to look at the results here. Once we discover these domains with the methods we introduced, we were interested in seeing how were these domains used. Were they just simple things or some advanced malware? So in this slide, we show that there are Zeus variants CNCing back to these domains, and these domains were serving the three types of URLs. So we have generic Zeus, Citadel, Kins, and Ice9. On the other end, you have like ASPROX type beaconing traffic, but also some phishing URLs use some of these domains, and some miscellaneous cases we'll cover. So this is just for your reference. I hope you can see it. If not, you can check the slides later or the white paper. But this is generic Zeus phoning back to those fast flux CNC domains. We also have Citadel examples. A few were used by KINS and ICE9. But then also we had some phishing URLs being served by these fast flux domains. And then we also saw a lot of ASPROX beaconing traffic. ASPROX is a botnet used mainly for click fraud. So maybe that's not very clear, but you can check it on the slides later. And then an interesting case was this DDoS bot, Madness Pro. So it was using one of these domains and it was announcing itself. Here we can see that it's announcing the operating system it's running. Then a few other examples of downloading binaries and configs from some of these fast flux domains. Now we did some more research and we found that one of these domains was also hosting a pony panel. What is pony? I'm sure a lot of you know about it. It's an info stealer. It mainly steals like FTP client passwords and applications running on Windows, and it's delivered via exploit kits or spam email. This is how it's advertised on hacking forums, and this is how it's detected by AV vendors. Now, if we dig deeper into the content of the website, we found some interesting things. Some of them is that there's a passwords module where you have the list of all of the applications for which they want to steal the passwords. And then we also see that the character set is Cyrillic and the time zone is Moscow. So this is an indication of either the writer or the users are from that time zone. Again, for reference, some of the modules that we found on the panel. And then this is the list of the applications, mainly of FTP clients for which they try to steal passwords from. And then the database schema you can see in one of the files. And then what we did further is that we searched for key terms we found on the panel on Google and trying to find if we have any other similar sites having the same structure. Interestingly, one of them had the same structure, and it was hosting another piece of malware. In this case, it was an Andromeda botnet malware piece. And then this is another list of panels we found. Now, let's look at some stats about this fast flux proxy network. So the domains, taking a sample of around 900 plus domains, we saw that it was mainly using .ru and .su. .com also comes third. And if we looked at the IPs that are at the basis of the proxy network, we saw that the lion's share was in Russia and Ukraine. On the other end, if we wanted to look at the clients looking up these domains during 24 hours, like DNS lookups, they were mainly in the United States. Now, you might think this is because the bad actors are targeting North American machines, because that's where you'll find like banking information and things like that. But maybe it's also because OpenDNS's traffic is mainly North American. And then finally, what we did is we took a sample of these CNC domains, and then we tried to see what kind of malware is phoning back to them. And with no surprise, Zbot was at the top of the list, and then Upatre was the second one. Upatre is a downloader for extra payload, and it has been involved in dropping Zeus Game Over as a second stage infection. As a conclusion, what we shared with you was basically that the Zbot fast flux proxy network is quite versatile. So everyone knows about FastFlux. It's been around for a while. But what we found out here is that it's very multi-purpose. A lot of malware families still use it. And it's serving all types of Zbot or Zeus URLs. Then the other interesting thing is that the TLDs most abused are .ru and .su. Moreover, the bots are mainly in Russia and Ukraine. So we see this kind of Russian connection here prevalent. And then at the end, we saw that the targets were mainly in the United States.
Thank you, Dia. That was an amazing description of the DNS style. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the IP style?
Sure. So to complete the first part, I'd like to answer you, Thibaut. So for that, we have mainly two parts. The premise of all of this is that IP-based reputation systems that are used for detecting malicious domains or IPs They they assign like scores to IPs, network prefixes, or ASNs by just counting the number of domains or IPs hosted on these entities. That works. But in this case, we wanted to push that further and take an innovative approach. For that, we wanted to enrich that method by looking at different granularity. So in this case, we looked at the granularity smaller than the BGP prefix, which is sub-allocated ranges. On the other end, we wanted to look at another perspective of the ASN kind of entity, which is the ASN graph topology. And with that, we found some really interesting things. So let's start with the sub-allocated ranges. So the investigation process goes like this. We monitor domains and IPs, and then we study the sub-allocated ranges where these IPs are living, and then we do fingerprinting of these IPs. With that, we were able to study over time the TTPs of the bad actors, the way they use the infrastructure and the way they time their attacks. Pushing that further, we were able to predictively block IPs destined for attacks, and we could also generalize this to a variety of attacks. And over all of this period, we were able to see how the bad actors were shifting in their behavior. So for that, we'll take an example, which was the nuclear exploit kit domains and how they were hosted a few months ago. So for several months, back in summer and fall of 2013, OVH Canada has been the most abused one. So in that case, we saw a small number of customers reserving these sub-allocated ranges. When I say sub-allocated ranges, I mean like /28, /29, /30, that are within like large prefixes. And then these IPs were exclusively used for these attacks. And then the IPs were brought online in bulk, like in the whole contiguous chunk was brought online at the same time. When they got a lot of heat from security researchers, the actors behind this shifted to a Ukrainian host and provider. And in that case, they changed their behavior. So in this case, they shifted from the errand space to the ripe space. In the errand space, we were able to use the whois to figure out the customer reserving these IPs. Whereas in the ripe space, the information was scarce and you were not able to figure out the customer. The other thing that changed is that the IPs are now brought online one at a time or in random fashion. So again, you can sense an invasion feel here. This lasted for 7 days. And then they shifted to another provider in Russia. They kept the same behavior here for 7 days. And then after that, they went back to OVH Canada, but in this instance, they changed one of the features of the behavior, which was now they're using recycled IPs. So IPs that have hosted old content, benign content. And again, you can think that this is a way to evade IP reputation systems if they can kind of figure out the heuristics used by security researchers. However, all of this time, the name servers of the nuclear exploit kit domains, they were still hosted on OVH IP space. So we might think that, okay, the bad guys or bad actors were thinking it's less likely to prove, it's more difficult to prove that the name server is malicious than to prove it for the nuclear exploit kit domain itself. Because in the domain itself, you can grab the landing page and the URL and you can figure out that it's serving that specific exploit kit. So we can see here that there's like they are quite smart in the way they shift and approach their business. Now this animation is quite interesting. It's basically a timeline view over several weeks, and we see the nuclear exploit kit domains popping in a firework fashion on single IPs. So you have a lot of ephemeral domains popping for a few minutes or hours, serving the attack and then disappearing. And they are never used again. The IPs also are never reused. We published a blog back in February about this, and then we also took takedown operations with the Malware Must Die group to decimate a lot of these nuclear exploit kit domains. Now, having done that, the next step was...
What's your prediction for the fight?
Prediction?
Yes, prediction.
Pain.
All right, so yeah, I believe Mr. T when he says pain, because we wanted to inflict pain on these bad actors, at least from our perspective. So for that, I'll share with you the way we did it. So it started with investigation. We took, again, like OVH's case, and in this table we see the monitoring of the ranges reserved by a small set of these suspicious customers, And we are able to see that, for example, in December, 28 ranges were reserved, like those small slashes, as we said, like 28, 29. And then within which there were 136 IPs. 63% of them were used for malicious purposes. The next month it was 41%. And then in February it was surprisingly very high, like 92% of the reserved IPs were used for malicious purposes. And then in March it was around 59%. So the point we're trying to make here is that this comes with, it's not a coincidence that these are heavily used for malicious purposes. There are these actors behind the scenes reserving these IPs, abusing certain large hosting providers, and delivering these attacks. Now, these IPs were used for serving three types of attacks: the nuclear exploit kit domains, the name servers of the domains, and also browser-based ransomware. Now, the interest of this approach can also be revealed by looking at the alternative. So let's say if we took all of those IPs and only looked at the BGP prefixes, we will see that they live in four major ones. And this granularity is very coarse. Like, you cannot tell much from just like a huge /17 or 18 or 19. Whereas in this case, we can narrow down our view and we can see that there's a high percentage of usage of these very small chunks of IPs reserved by the same guys. Now, the other novel approach we adopted was to fingerprint these IPs. As we were detecting them by looking at the reservation patterns, we also fingerprinted these IPs. So the two chunks we see there are the Ukrainian and Russian ones, and we can see that they share the same server setup. This is, again, it's no coincidence. Same with OVH, same server setup. And this was the same for both the domains and the name servers. Now, combining all of these indicators we described, we were able to generalize it across other attacks, and we were able to block or quarantine these IPs before they start hosting domains. So you don't have to wait until you see the domain in your traffic. By using these indicators and identifying these IP ranges, you can block them or quarantine them with a high likelihood that they will be suspicious. Now, doing all of this, as we said earlier, we were able to monitor and watch how the bad actors evolve in their TTPs. So one growing trend we noticed was the injection of malicious subdomains and their compromised domains. The investigation process was like this. So we detected these domains, injected under compromised domains, and then we collected the subdomains, the domains, and the IPs. And then over time, we were able to kind of have a list of the top abused ASNs. But again, the ASN is quite coarse in granularity. We wanted to have a finer view. So for that, we looked at the hosting providers, like the small scale ones. And with that, we were able to have a good picture of how the bad guys evolve. These IPs were serving mainly exploit kits, and GoDaddy was the main kind of abused provider here. And ZBot variants were dropped when the infection succeeds. So this is the list of the top abused ones. Unfortunately, OVH comes back as the most abused ones, taking a sample of these IPs with no surprise. And we saw ASNs across both ARIN and RIPE. So it's not exclusive to Europe or North America. Now, this table here kind of summarizes the behavior we observed. And I like this one because it gives us a nice evolution. So on the before, that's basically for several months, and now is the current state. So they used to abuse a lot of CCTLDs, like they registered domains through rogue or victim resellers or registrars, and they use them for the attacks. Nowadays, they still do that, but they also supplement it with injecting subdomains under compromised GoDaddy or other providers' domains. The other thing is, as we said, they use the IPs exclusively for the attacks. Nowadays, they use that, but they also recycle IPs, like old IPs, IPs that have hosted other benign content. And then third, they bring the IPs all at once. Previously, nowadays, they randomize things, so they bring them one at a time. So there's a lot of evasion and kind of shifting here. And then finally, they used to abuse OVH Canada. And as we mentioned, using the ARIN database, you were able to see the customers reserving these ranges. And it was kind of easy, I would say, relatively easy to predict the next IPs to deliver attacks. Whereas now they abuse OVH Europe, and as we said, RIPE is kind of scarce in details sometimes. And they are also abusing IPs in different countries, like across all of the European countries. So it's interesting to see how they kind of reacted well and trying to always stay a step ahead. Now looking at the small abused or rogue hosting providers, this one came out, and it's described as a bulletproof hosting provider by Web of Trust. So this guy is a very small scale one, and usually they rent IP space from different upstream providers. So you'll see them like having IPs in Germany through Hetzner, Netherlands with LeaseWeb, maybe Canada or US with OVH, maybe United Kingdom with MyLock or some other British providers. This is another one in Russia serving the same type of attacks. This one is from Bulgaria. Unfortunately, the cute one, Electric Kitten, was also a victim. And that shows that even North American hosters are also, they are not immune to this type of abuse. A few others for your reference, you can check them out later. And then we took this a little bit further. We were interested in looking at these labels, like the subdomains. Is there like a pattern in the way they are injected? And we took like a large list of these malicious subdomains, and we found out that there were a few that were really, they were like highly used. So police and alert police happen to be used for browser-based ransomware attacks. It's the case where you get a web page loads in your browser telling you, hey, you've been looking at some weird content and you'll be chased by the FBI or the local police if you don't pay a ransom. It's quite benign because you can just like kill the browser or disable scripts. But we see that the theme here is police and alert police, and it's recurrent in a lot of these domains. However, for the rest of the domains, they were mainly kind of random, but they were still being taken from English dictionaries. So what we shared with you now is the fine granularity, smaller than the BGP prefix. The other piece, as we mentioned earlier, was the ASN graph approach. And for that, we need to know about the internet first.
Yeah, let's use this. Okay, so the next section we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can use relationships on the internet between different prefixes, different ASNs, and so on and so forth to sort of predict where malware is going to be hosted. But before that, we need to make sure we're all on the same page and make sure that we fully understand how the internet works, because everybody has a different understanding. For example, if I ask my dad what the internet looks like, he'll probably look in the corner of the living room and point to that little black device. It's a cable modem or a DSL modem, right? If I ask a sales guy, he'll probably draw a cloud and pretty pictures and stuff like that. Then I walk on to the next room and I ask our IT guys what the internet looks like, and they probably start to giggle, and it reminds them of this one episode of the IT Crowd where they got to borrow the internet for a day, and it was a magic black box with a blinking light. And as you can see, there's no wires, it's all wireless. It's pretty cool, but you know, the internet's no magic black box. In fact, it's actually quite pretty if you wanted to draw it. It's a graph, it's a network of networks, and this is one picture of the internet. Basically what we're looking at here is each dot in this graph is an autonomous system. And an autonomous system is basically a collection of networks under the administrative control of one organization. So for example, OpenDNS with many servers and prefixes is one autonomous system. Facebook is one, Microsoft is one, so on and so forth. Each autonomous system is identified by a number. So sometimes you hear the term ASN, which stands for AS number. So for example, OpenDNS is 36692. These are just numbers assigned to you by Ripe, Aaron, etc. And then each autonomous system, each dot in this graph announces one or more IPv4 or IPv6 prefixes. So we have this big graph, they're all connected to each other, because obviously if you're just one autonomous system, you're not really an internet, you're a network, but you're not connected to the rest of the network. So you need to be connected to at least one other provider, typically a service provider, or you know, in a better case, you're connected to multiple of them. And then each autonomous system announces one or more prefixes. So now imagine that you're on like the left-hand side of this graph and you need to go to the right-hand side because that's where Google lives or Facebook. You need to figure out how to get there. And that's where BGP comes into play. BGP is the routing protocol used on the internet, and it's used to announce which prefixes exist and how you get there. And basically, you can build this graph. Your routers build graphs based on this data, and now you can find a path through the network. So we use that data to basically build a large graph of the internet and study the relationships. We use our own data, like we have 25 data centers, 23 data centers worldwide. where we get data. We have several service providers there. We do peering, so we have lots of feeds coming in. But we also use publicly available data, route views, RIPE, BGPmon, and so on and so forth. There's a few listed here. Just for your interest, there's roughly 500,000 BGP prefixes out there right now, and about 46,000 ASNs on the internet today. So you can imagine it's a pretty big graph with lots of relationships. These are some of the websites, just for your reference, where you can find information about that. So let's take a look at how we build a graph. Basically, all we need to do is download this data somehow from the BGP data. If you export it, there's a tool, BGP dump, and basically you can see the output on the last line of this slide. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but the important parts are marked in red, where you can see the actual prefix, and then the second part is basically a sequence of numbers, which we call the ASPAF, which is basically one line in the graph. But you can infer all kinds of interesting data from this. So for example, the one on the right-hand side, 36692, is OpenDNS, is the originator of the actual prefix. So now you have the prefix to ASN mapping. You can also see that that number is connected to 2914, which provides it with internet access to the rest of the internet. 2914 represents NTT, so now I know, okay, OpenDNS probably buys transit connectivity from NTT. And there's a few other relationships that you can see from this image. But there's a lot of interesting data. You can see who owns what, who announces what, who's connected to who, and even business relationships. So the next step is to start using some of this graph data, and Thibaut is going to tell us about that.
Thank you, Andre. So Andre just explained how we can extract, graph data from the BGP routing tables. So same concept here. We use the same library, and we can create our own graph in JSON format. Now, how do we visualize this? So right now we have converted data in JSON, right? This all represent like nodes and edges and connections. So it's very simple. We use some particle physics, and even if you're not good at math, don't run now, because it's very simple to understand. Essentially, every pair of nodes that is connected is going to attract each other, and every pair of nodes that is disconnected is going to repulse each other. So for the math nerds out there, you have like the formulas around here. So as you can see, you have the attractive force here and the repulsive force, and they all depend on the distance between the nodes. And then finally, you see that those formulas depend on the constant k that depends on the area divided by the number of nodes. In other words, the density. So it's like a lot of complicated words just to say that we can control the density of the layout with just a simple constant. This is how it looks like. At first, all the nodes are like in the same position. We can place them also in a random fashion, doesn't really matter. Then we start running the physics. So as you can see, you have this kind of a explosion of data. So the process here has been slowed down just for the demonstration, right? But usually it goes much faster than that. So here you can see, this sort of layout that looks like a molecule or something, which makes complete sense because the force-directed layout, has been inspired by, forces like the electrical forces that happen, or like celestial bodies as well. It's not the same formulas because the model is way too complicated to implement on the CPU, but it's very inspired by that. Then after a couple of iterations, you can see that those nodes are vibrating. So that means the forces are becoming even, like usually the graph has reached the equilibrium state. So usually means that you have a visually pleasing layout. But we have one problem here, because this runs fine, on like a couple thousand nodes. But like the ASN network is really big. So to be able to do exactly the same thing, we have to use some parallelization. And to do that, libraries such as OpenCL, which is actually more like a specifications, but some of the implementations help us really divide the computation really well. So it just exposes a couple of work groups, work items, which can be seen as like core and threads on the GPU. And finally, it also exposes different kinds of memory. So global memory, local memory, and private memory. So essentially, the difference between those memories are the time to access them. So private memory is very fast to access. It's like located in the core and threads. So it's like almost like registers, right? And the global memory would be this large chunk of memory that everybody can access. So there's essentially like a trade-off between the time to access the memory and also the ease that you have to access it. Now, one very important point is, why do we do this? Like, you're looking at the picture, you're like, okay, that's pretty cool, but why do we want to do that? So the first point is like the layout is data-driven versus user-driven. As you can see, the layout depends on the forces, and the forces depend on the connections and the edges between the nodes. So the resulting layout is only going to depend on data structure that you had originally. It is much closer to what I like to call the natural shape of the data structure. And we can take huge advantage of the GPU for acceleration. Nowadays the GPUs have become insanely good at doing like vectorial computation. So it would be a shame not to take advantage of that. And finally, main point, humans are so much better at processing shapes and color. We're going to see that in a second. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the process. So here we start, on this OpenCL view. Everything is like looks like a big mess at first. All the nodes, all the nodes that you see here represent the ESN nodes. So yeah, at first everything is in bulk. It doesn't really make sense. And then we're going to start running the iterations on OpenCL. So as we've seen in the second on the video, there you go. So as you can see, it's a pretty heavy process. That runs on the NVIDIA GTX 550, which is like a graphic card is like around 3-4 years old, almost equivalent to what you have in the MacBook Pros, the recent ones. So these are the first iterations of the process. Now I can also mention that this layout is not really supposed to be eye candy, right? It's completely based on performance and stuff like that. So you don't see the edges here, only the nodes. And that runs for an hour. After an hour, we get something like this. So as you can see here, the cluster are very apparent. I'm going to let Andre describe it in a minute because his expertise is much better than mine. But essentially what you can see at first glance is that the internet has, the ESN network has a very, very densely connected core and like a lot of peripheral nodes around.
Yeah, so this is a really nice picture of the internet as a network geek. I like this. So one of the terms we often use in networking, sort of a loosely defined term, is tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, where tier 1 is sort of the core of the internet. There's only a dozen or so, and those are like level 3, NTT, AT&T. And then there's a larger number of tier 2s around there. Those are the larger regional networks, country telcos. Which you can see sort of, so the tier 1s are the really, really bright ones, and then the pink ones are sort of the tier 2s, and then the tier 3s are sort of the ones in yellow on the edge, and those are by far the majority of the autonomous systems are considered like that. But they can be really large as well. It can be Microsoft, Google, Facebook. They're all sitting on the edge of the network from a network perspective because they don't typically have any customers in terms of like network connectivity. This is another one, just same data, different visualization. You can very well see the tier 1s and then different clusters. Sometimes these clusters actually represent different countries. You can see that here as well. So talking about countries, this is a visualization of the internet in the Ukraine, where you can see that every network in the Ukraine is very reliant on only 1 or 2 providers here. If you would cut out that one provider, all of the country would be, or a significant number of networks in the country would be offline. And that's what we've seen over the last few years, I'd say. It started with the Arab Spring, where Egypt was taken offline by the government. That was only really easy because there's only like 4 major telcos in Egypt. And similarly, over the last year or so in Syria, where we've seen Syria just basically disappear for several hours, just because there's only one telco. You bring one telco, and all the other ASNs behind them will go down as well. So that's a really interesting things you can see from these pretty pictures. Okay, I'll let Dia talk about the next one.
All right, thanks guys. So this was a very interesting perspective of the internet from a data visualization and also a network engineering perspective. But now, how can we use that for catching maliciousness? So for that, we introduced the concept of sibling peripheral ASNs, and we look for suspicious ones. And we'll share with you a case here we have. So the investigation process is monitoring domains and IPs. That's our starting point. And then we look at the IP ranges and fingerprint them, just to see how related they are. And then we also study the relationships between the ASNs from a graph topology perspective. With that, we are able to propose a detection model based on the ASN view. And then we will introduce a novel approach to relate ASNs together by just looking at the BGP outages, like the BGP announcement outages, and bulk few together. So for this use case, we're looking at a stream of domains hosted on a large number of IPs, and they were delivering the Trojan downloader you see on the third bullet. And these domains, they were living on IPs on entire /23s and /24s, contiguous IPs. This is how it's described by some of the, detected by some of the AV vendors. And then what we did is we took a sample of these IPs, and then we fingerprinted them, and we saw that there were like two big clusters. Again, the same approach as the previous study. We have similar server setup. So again, this is no coincidence. These guys are setting these up in bulk beforehand to deliver these attacks. Now, the other thing we did is, in addition to the fingerprinting, we wanted to look at the structure of the graph. So for that, we introduced the concept of sibling peripheral nodes. Sibling in the sense they share the same upstream provider. So at the top, you see a bunch of ASNs. They are in red because they are hosting that malicious payload. And then the bottom one is the upstream provider. He's kind of the parent of these little kids. And then they depend on him to announce their prefixes. Peripheral because they have no downstream providers. That means no one relies on them to announce their prefixes. So they are kind of on the outskirts or the suburbs of the internet. Now we take a snapshot of such a structure from the Ukrainian-Russian IP space. And we see here we have a 10 sibling peripheral ASNs sharing two upstream providers. Both siblings, both children and parents are hosting some of the malicious payload. And then a month and a half later, we saw that the structure changed. So one of the upstream providers detached itself. It stopped announcing the prefixes of the kids. And then more of the kids started hosting the malicious payload. So the conclusion we came to, in fact, we observed this across other cases, but we just summarized this one for your attention. We saw a lot of these malicious domains being hosted on a lot of these IPs. These IPs were sharing the same fingerprint. They were in like contiguous chunks. And if you look at the entire structure, you see that they are living in these related ASNs. And more interestingly, some of these IPs, they were hosting the payload before any domain would start resolving to them. So you could just grab the payload by just doing like a curl on the IP slash the path. So again, as we said earlier, this is a setup in bulk and in advance, and it's no coincidence. Now let's look at the SPN concept from a data visualization perspective.
Thank you, Dia. So yeah, I would like to give a visual approach of what the SPN concept is that Dia just proposed. So let's start with a very simple graph. It doesn't represent anything, it's just a random graph. So when we study graph topology, we're usually very interested in what we call the degree of the nodes. Degree is the number of connections. And then we can pretty much classify every node depending on its degree. So as you can see here, for example, I'm going to start with the blue node. Blue node is a sync node. It means it only has like incoming connections. And then you can see the green node, which is called a leaf. A leaf has only one outgoing connection. Then finally, you can see the red ones who are the source nodes. These are only ones who have two or more outgoing connections. And the rest, the white nodes, are like pretty much other nodes that don't really respond to those criteria. So when we apply, the SPN detection, this is what happens. So we start same graph, right? And then we are pretty much going to only keep the peripheral nodes. The peripheral nodes are the nodes that don't have any incoming connections. So they are like completely, as Adia said, on the outskirts of the graph. And then we only keep their parents. And that gives us, this SPN graph. So all the peripheral node with their siblings and their parents. So we can do exactly the same thing on the Ukrainian ASN network. And this is what it looks like. So the same data set as before, right? The same Ukrainian ASN network. So what you're looking at here is pretty much when I activate, the edge LOD filter on the left, you're going to see the difference between, before and after the extraction. So what we see here is pretty much we completely remove and completely prune the core of the graph. We only keep kind of at the suburbs of the graph. This is what we're interested in this SPN model. Then finally, you can propose or select a couple of candidates. Like this one, for example, you see a couple of leaves all together, and they're connected to the same parent. Same successor in graph theory terms. And this is like a potential candidate for our detection model. Now, the thing that you may think right now is there are a lot of candidates in this huge, Ukrainian ASN network. So a better approach to do that is to start with an ASN that is known as malicious or like suspicious, and detect if it has potential like siblings with the same model.
Cool. So why are we talking about all this? So just a summary of what Dia just said. So this was one of the, I guess, sort of sibling ASNs in the Ukraine. And all the ones with red dots were basically hosting the same identical malware. But the other interesting part was that the fingerprints of these machines were basically all identical. Which is interesting because normally, as we just said before, autonomous systems are typically owned and operated by one administrative domain. But looking at what we saw there, it's like, well, it seems like all these machines are owned and operated, or at least operated by the same entity, because they're almost identical, right? They came online at the same time, same malware, same fingerprints. That's weird, right? So we sort of made this presumption like, well, you know what? We think that these different machines or different ASNs are actually owned and operated by the same person. Which is different than how we normally think, because, you know, how do we normally block malware or drop malware? So we look at the domain name, we look at an IP, we can look at a complete prefix, and sometimes we go even as far as just block a whole ASN. But we never really go further. It's like, well, maybe all these other ASNs are connected or somehow related as well. So we made that presumption or that hypothesis. Basically, we think that they're all basically, even though that they're different ASNs, we think they're all one ASN. And we figured, how can we prove that that's the case? And one way we're doing that is by looking at outages. Like if they're really living on the same infrastructure, if one ASN goes down, the other one must go down as well. So we tried to prove that. So to do that, we partnered with bgpmon.net, which has a database of BGP outages of the last 2 years. So we could fill in a prefix, an ASN, or even a country and say, show me all the outages. So how do they detect outages? Basically, there's two important BGP messages. Update messages basically says, I know a route to this prefix with this AS path. And then a withdrawal message is basically the same router saying, well, I know I just previously told you about this path, but I no longer have a path to this network, so don't send it to me. Then if you do this from hundreds of routers worldwide, correlate that, then you can think, okay, if I see a withdrawal message and an hour later everybody has an update message again, then you know that there was an outage for 1 hour, and you can know exactly when the begin and the end time was. So we used that data to basically try to figure out if there were indeed any overlapping outages. And indeed there were. So this is just a big matrix with lots of numbers that you probably can't even read. But you can see that the numbers are high. Basically what it shows is that all the ASNs and how many overlapping outages there were. And the number is high, which means there were a lot of overlapping outages. So let's just zoom into 2 of them, or 3. So this is the same graph again. The number on the right, 48,361, that's the upstream ASN. So if that one would go down, then we know that all the other ones must go down as well, because everybody's relying on that. But there were only a few overlapping outages with the actual upstream ASNs. All the other child ASNs had up to like 22 overlapping outages over the course of just 6 months. And it wasn't just like a 1-minute outage or so. No, this is sort of the same data. So you see that the ISP in the left column had no outage. And this is just for the month of July, where 2 different ASNs, both of the child ASNs, had like outages starting at like 9:30 or so, 497 minutes. And some of these outages were really, really long. But it's really rare to see autonomous systems, or different autonomous systems have overlapping outages to that extent. That's not normal. So I think it's sort of proved the presumption that we made. It's like, yeah, these guys are definitely relying on the same infrastructure. And I think they're probably the same guys. But what we can say is they're relying on the same infrastructure. They could be in the same data center, maybe relying on the same power. They could be on the same routers, switches, we don't know. Maybe the switch goes down, everyone else goes down. But you could even say, maybe they're even on the same hardware, the same physical machines with different IP addresses representing different ASNs, but they could be on the same hardware. Whatever it is, they're most likely the same guys hiding behind different ASNs. And we're going to use that same data to now find, if we know a bad ASN, we can within a few seconds find other ASNs that had similar overlapping outages and start zooming in to them. So it's a pretty unique and cool way to find other suspicious ASNs.
Thanks, Andre. So yeah, that was like a novel approach to use BGP outages that confirmed a lot of the things we saw from different perspectives. So in conclusion, what we shared with you was the way some of the ways we catch maliciousness from a DNS perspective and IP perspective. The DNS part was focusing on the ZBot Fast Flux proxy network and how it's used by different families of malware. And then from the IP perspective, we looked at different granularities like the sub-allocated ranges, fingerprinting, but also the ASN graph topology. We also saw that trend of injecting malicious subdomains under compromised domains. So we see a lot of trends here changing on the side of the bad actors. And with this, we were able to predict most of the time the IPs being used for attacks. Most importantly, we open sourced this week our novel 3D visualization engine, and we really invite you to use it, to contribute, and to share it with the community, because it's an amazing tool that we believe can add a lot to the security community and the way we catch bad things. Thank you for your attention. These are some of our references. And follow us on Twitter if you want to keep in touch. And feel free to ask questions. Thanks again.
So the belief propagation that you're doing across your graph seems to use a binary variable, presence of malware. What if the adversaries force you into a continuous variable space by, for example, routing Tor traffic through their ASNs, and so there are legitimate actors that you might not be comfortable blacklisting by applying your graph control? What's the defense then?
Have you seen anything about Twitter? Tor.
Meaning, your graph colors are based on a binary variable. There was malware on this IP or this ASN. So what if it's a non-binary variable? What if we can? What if an attacker says, "Fine, I'll route some good traffic through here," and now you've got users who are being affected by your actioning model based on the ASN linkage?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand what you're saying. Basically, you're saying, what if I can force traffic through a certain ASN by source routing or BGP injection?
Yeah, or using Tor and saying, hey, I'll just set up some exit nodes on the ASNs that you're targeting. And there are good users who are legitimately doing that, and so they can induce false positives that your model will now punish.
I think we didn't really look at how it's routed. We're primarily looking at who is originating and hosting the data.
Right, what I'm getting at is, though, you've got a black-white binary coloring belief that you're propagating through the graph. What if they can make it gray?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you very well earlier. But yes, so you're saying if you might, you assign like some kind of a score to the ASNs or to the edges linked in the ASNs?
On the vertices that you guys are coloring as having problematic traffic, you're saying we observe malware coming from here, and then we're propagating across the edges that you're connecting through through DNS and IP data. So the problem is that the belief, right, the observations that you're making about the presence of malware is a binary variable. Either there was malware or there wasn't malware. In the presence of malware, you propagate, punish, you push the belief through the graph. What if the belief itself is undermined by an attacker who says, fine, I'm going to return the pain to you, and now it's not all bad or all good, it's bad mixed with good in a way that you're not willing to accept. How do you defend
I see the case you're describing. In fact, we did not implement that, so we're not saying the maliciousness propagates in the graph we had. What we were doing is look at how they are related from either a upstream downstream relationship or
right,
from
the edges, yeah,
or from reservation perspective. So we were not saying that okay, this ASN is hosting this much badness. How can we propagate that? It's like a PageRank thing, maybe. Or
sure, but your action model, right? What you then do with the observation that this particular node in the graph is a problem is you blacklist it entirely.
well,
I don't think we block the whole ASN, right? We just use it as a metric. And like, hey, this ASN is weird. There's something going on. And because there's so much address space out there, that you need to start somewhere. So we use this method to just find suspicious ASNs and then start zooming into that AS number, like start fingerprinting all of it, start taking a close look at all their DNS data, and so on and so forth. But we don't block a whole ASN.
Okay.
I hope that answered, but
Yeah,
maybe we can do
Other
it.
people have questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Just to follow up quickly, in fact, what we did is that we used that intel to zoom. Let's say we identify a malicious one, and then from the relationships he has via the ASN topology or the BGP outage, we find some other candidates. Then we go down again to the BGP prefixes, and maybe we'll fingerprint the IPs within that range. And if we find some that are like small ranges reserved by the same guys, so it's kind of you start from a point, you go up, and then you zoom down, and so it's kind of that movement of granularity that goes fine to coarse, down to fine, and so we don't say with, it's not like saying this is bad, just block the entire thing.
Sure. I'm just asserting that, you know, if I'm a bad guy and I want to hide and I can surround myself with innocence, I can prevent you from taking me out.
The thing is, you'll still have to take actions to do your thing. So that action leaves traces. And somehow it will be out there. So the point we're making is that with these indicators, we're able to find a lot of these kind of traces that the bad actors leave. So it's like one way in the right direction. But like we showed, the TTPs change a lot and they shift strategies, and you just have to be up to speed with them to find out what's their next step. I hope that answers some of your questions. You're welcome.
So you guys have, you're looking to provide this community and have us kind of collectively share information. Is the idea, or at least do you have a share space to share all the malicious IPs that we have found? Because like I block on average, permanently block over 1 million IPs, and just on a daily average, I block in between probably about 300 to 5,000 IPs, unique. The variance in their attacks is, you know, like I do login pages, brute force attacks, and also just general cross-site scripting, SQL injection. What I'm looking for a community, because this tool is actually very similar to what we do already, and it's actually more expansive and complementary. I'm looking for a community that is sharing this information, but as a community, not a proprietary, you guys came up with this list and that's, you know what's going on kind of thing. Like, just so the community could collectively share this information and share their observations to help other people make a collective decision, so we can help identify whether or not we really do have a bad guy.
Yeah, I see your point. So we could take this offline, but the quick answer is we have a product that started as a research effort, what we call now Investigate. It used to be called S-Graph. And it's basically a front end to all of the analytics and intelligence we build using recursive and authoritative DNS traffic. And with that, you can also, make queries for domains, IPs, ASNs, prefixes, and see which ones are blacklisted, which ones are identified with certain attacks. So we offer access to researchers by, talking to us offline, but also we offer that as a service, as a product. So certain customers will require that service where they can do like bulk API lookups for like hundreds of thousands of domains a day or per hour. And we give them back all of the scores and indicators we have about those entities they're asking questions about. So yeah, we could figure something out either from a research perspective or from a product perspective.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions? Thank you.